One winter in the 1140s, a storm erased the road before the travelers understood they were lost. By late afternoon, the fen track in eastern England had disappeared under blown snow, cart ruts vanished, boundary ditches filled. Even the willow posts used to guide men across the low ground turned into pale, useless shapes. Then, through the whiteout, one light appeared. It came from a small alehouse squatting beside a frozen crossing, its thatch bent under the weight of snow, its shutters leaking a weak yellow glow. To the men and women fighting toward it, that light looked like warmth, but inside the keeper saw something else. She saw 31 cold bodies. 31 wet cloaks. 31 mouths. And one black iron cauldron hanging over a fire that was already too small. Her name was Elswyth. She had run the alehouse for years, long enough to know that winter did not kill only with ice. It killed with bad counting. A little too much wood burned early. A little too much bread handed out while people still felt hopeful. A little too much ale poured because fear made men thirsty. So when the last traveler stumbled through the door, and the storm slammed it shut behind him, Elswyth did not greet the room like guests. She counted them like a problem. The alehouse was not built for comfort, it was a working room of oak beams, packed earth, smoke-black rafters, and walls sealed with wattle and daub. The hearth sat in the center, not grand, not generous, just alive enough to keep death outside. Wet wool steamed around it, boots softened the dirt floor into dark paste. The air tasted of smoke, sour ale, damp straw, and hunger. Over the fire hung the thing that would decide the night, the cauldron. Inside it was not a feast, it was pottage. Barley and oats had been boiled down until they swelled into a thick, cloudy mass. Dried peas broke apart in the heat. Leeks and onions gave it a sharp green smell, a strip of salted pork fat, cut smaller than anyone wanted, melted slowly across the top and vanished into the starch. It was poor food. Ordinary food. Food no lord would brag about. But in that room, it became a clock. Each ladle bought a little more time before shaking hands became useless. Each crust dipped into the bowl turned cold bodies back into thinking bodies. Each mouthful told the storm, not yet. Elswyth did not serve the pottage in generous bowls. She served it in rounds. 3 wooden bowls moved from bench to bench. A merchant with frozen beard ate after a ditcher whose hands were split from winter labor. A young monk passed bread to a woman holding a sleeping child under her cloak. A drover, still smelling of wet animals, scraped the side of the bowl and looked ashamed when he realized others were watching. Status thinned quickly in the heat of the hearth. Outside, the storm rose harder. Snow drove against the shutters until the wood seemed to breathe. The door vanished under a bank of white. Every few minutes a gust struck the building hard enough to make the hanging cups knock together along the wall. No one said much after that. The sound outside had become too large for conversation. Elswyth kept moving. She shifted a log deeper into the coals. She pulled the cauldron lower, then higher. She sent her young helper, Toma, down into the storage pit beneath the back room. He returned with a sack of peas, a coil of dried eel, and one small crock of rendered fat sealed under linen. The room watched the crock as if it were treasure. Elswyth did not open it. Not yet. That was when the first argument began. A wool packer, broad-shouldered and red-faced from ale, said the food was too thin. He had paid for shelter. He had paid for drink. If the road was closed, he said, then the keeper owed them strength enough to last. Elswyth looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the ladle, drew up the pottage, and let it fall back into the pot in a slow rope. Too thin keeps 30 alive, she said. Too thick feeds 10, and buries the rest. No one laughed, no one answered. Because she was right. Medieval hunger did not always look like an empty table. Sometimes it looked like a full pot being stretched with hot water. It looked like bread torn into smaller pieces. It looked like fat saved until the cold had done its worst. The trick was not to fill every belly at once, the trick was to keep every body burning until morning. So the cauldron changed. Elswyth added water, and waited for the barley starch to bloom again. She crumbled older bread into the steam to thicken it. She shaved the dried eel so thin the pieces nearly disappeared. She salted only enough to wake the tongue, not enough to make men demand more ale. Even the ale was controlled. It sat in wooden barrels against the rear wall, dark and sour, safer than river water, and useful against thirst. But Elswyth poured it small, a cup shared by 3, then 4, men who would have complained in fair weather accepted it in silence. Because they could hear the roof groaning above them. Near midnight, the storm found the weak places. A line of snow blew under the rear shutter and melted on the floor. The thatch began to sag over the west beam. Somewhere outside, a branch cracked with the sound of bone. The child under the cloak woke and began to cry, not loudly, but steadily, the thin cry of a body losing heat. For the first time, fear moved openly through the room. People turned toward the door. Then toward the roof. Then toward the cauldron. That was the darkest hour of the night, not because the food was gone, but because everyone understood how close enough really was. Enough fire meant not warm, only not frozen. Enough bread meant not full, only not fainting. Enough ale meant not comfort, only a wet throat and a body that could still swallow. Toma came back from the storage pit with the last bundle of dry sticks. He held them out to Elswyth like an apology. The woolpacker saw them and stood again, slower this time. "Use the fat," he said. Others looked at the crock. Elswyth listened to the wind. She looked at the child, then she opened the linen seal. The smell changed first. Rendered pork fat hit the cauldron and spread through the room, rich enough to make every head lift. She stirred it once, then twice, until the surface shone in the firelight. It was not much. It could not make the meal large. But it made the next round matter. The bowls went out again. This time, no one hurried. They dipped bread. They passed the bowl, they swallowed slowly, as if slow eating could fool the body into believing there was more. The monk murmured a prayer under his breath. The drover took the smallest spoonful and pushed the bowl toward the woman with the child. The woolpacker looked at the cauldron, then at the keeper, and sat down without another word. Something had shifted. The alehouse was still cold, the roof still strained, the storm still held them like a fist. But the room had stopped behaving like a crowd. And started behaving like a ration. That was the hidden strength of a medieval alehouse meal in a storm. It was not the ingredients, barley, peas, leeks, stale bread, a trace of pork fat, rough ale, none of it was remarkable. The power was in the order. The fire had to be fed before fear demanded it, the thick food had to be thin before pride wasted it. The bowls had to be shared before rank could divide the room. And the richest ingredient had to wait until the body truly needed proof that it could last. Near dawn, the sound outside changed. The wind lost its teeth, the shutters stopped trembling. Snow still pressed against the door, but it no longer came like an attack. Pale light seeped through the cracks in the wall, turning the smoke in the rafters gray. Elswyth lifted the cauldron from the hook, there was almost nothing left inside. Only a skin of barley clinging to the iron, a few broken peas, and the smell of fat and smoke. The travelers did not cheer. They were too tired for that. They stood carefully, as if their bones had become old overnight. Together, they dug the door open with bowls, boards, and bare hands wrapped in cloth. When the door finally gave way, the world outside looked newly made and hostile. The road was gone, the ditches were gone, the fields had become one white surface with no memory of where men were meant to walk. One by one they stepped out. They carried no story of a feast, no miracle dish, no overflowing table. What they remembered was a black cauldron above a small fire, a keeper who refused to waste comfort on panic, and a meal plain enough to be forgotten in any easier winter. But that night, plain food did the one thing luxury could not do. It lasted. And in a storm that had erased the road, the richest thing in the alehouse was not meat, bread, or ale. It was time. Served by the ladle, from a black iron pot.